Well, hey there, All In podcast listeners. You may have heard me mention on the show that I host an original podcast other than the All In Show podcast. That's called Why Is This Happening? It's a weekly podcast. And the idea behind it is I get to take a step back from the day-to-day onslaught of news and take a broader look at the issues that I'm obsessed with, that are keeping me up at night, that I'm curious about but haven't had time to cover on the show. Each week, I'm joined by uniquely qualified guests who help me make sense of these issues. So what we thought we would do is post a few of our favorite episodes of that podcast here in the All In podcast feed. This week, I wanted to share this conversation I had with this remarkable ACLU lawyer, Chase Strangio, on the social and legal fight for trans rights, and also the kind of conceptual underpinning of the fight for gender equality and what that means, what gender actually means in the 21st century, both in a sort of conceptual and legal sense. I learned so much for this conversation. So if you like what you hear, please search Why Is This Happening wherever you're listening now and subscribe.
Over time, we're just going to see that we're making these choices, and the more comfortable we are with the reality that your rule is no neater than ours, that we're just going to have to come to terms with like the fact that you might be peeing next to someone with different genitals than you, and that's just been true forever.
Hello, and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. So when I was in college in 1997 to 2001, my then partner and now wife, we were in college together. We met freshman year. And as one does when one is young and in love and in college, we spent a lot of time like talking about the things that we were reading and studying and staying up late and debating them. And Kate, who's been a guest on With Pod before, was a gender studies major. Well, gender studies and religious studies. And in gender studies, she was reading all this literature that I would then kind of like read as well so that we could talk about it. And one of the things she read then was the theorist Judith Butler. And Judith Butler, you may or may not know her. She writes in this incredibly difficult, some might say, recondite or impenetrable prose. But some of her basic theoretical ideas are both fairly simple and elegant and also really profound. And one of the most central is the idea that gender, maleness and femaleness, as we think about it, is performance. It's something that is produced by a set of performative actions in a social context. And that may seem, I think in 2019, that doesn't seem like a crazy radical thing to say, partly because of the success of both movements for LGBT rights and also Butler and other theorists' work in popularizing this basic idea. But at the time, I remember having my mind blown a little bit because we are taught from such a young age that male and female, man and woman, boy and girl, are essential characteristics of the universe. Like they're just things out there in the world, like atoms. Like there's, an atom just is. That's a unit of mass, and it is a sort of coherent entity in the universe itself. It's part of the fabric of the universe. And I think that we learn that like male and female are part of the fabric of the universe. Like that's just the way it is. And I read Judith Butler, thanks to Kate, and she basically says, not really. It's a category that we make, a category that is maybe not that different from, say, Brahmin and untouchable, right? Now, Brahmin and untouchable, we don't think are, if we live in the West particularly and are not born into the subcontinent where there's a long tradition of this, we, from the Western perspective, we look at Brahmin and untouchable, we're like, you guys made that up. That's not like a thing actually in the world. Like, that's just like a cultural thing you guys made. Like, we all know that. That's not like a part of the universe. Of course, people raised in that tradition can see it as part of the universe, which is the way these categories work. But the idea that gender was like that, the idea that gender was not a part of the universe, that it was something constructed and performed socially, was a radical idea. And part of understanding that is dividing the concepts between gender as a kind of social contract and then biological sex, which is the sort of physical attributes a body has. But then there was another theorist who actually was at Brown, who was both a biologist and a gender studies theoretician named Anna Fausta Sterling, who wrote this book called Sexing the Body, which I also read or also read parts of or got downloads of from Kate because she was reading it in class. And that book actually says, look, biologically, there are lots of folks who are born with features that are somewhere between male and female as we sort of traditionally understand them. And the medical complex goes to work kind of actually changing their bodies so that they fit more squarely into these binary categories we have. So even at the level of biology, this thing that we think of as inherent into the universe is not as complicated and binary as it seems. So all of that is a way of sort of setting the groundwork for today's conversation, because today's conversation is about trans rights in America at this particular political moment. But the background context, I think, to that is actually thinking deeply about the nature of gender, the nature in which political and social systems construct gender and use gender in all sorts of ways, both in capitalism for marketing, in social orders for hierarchy, and the kind of, in some ways, really profound challenge that transgender folks and trans rights pose to this entire system that is constructed, this entire system in which the universe is cleaved in two, and that's just the way everything is. And I think that understanding that kind of conceptual turn, which I think is easier for younger people who have been more immersed in the notion of gender performance than it is for older people who are more immersed in the idea of like, there's these two categories and they're in the universe. That's a key conceptual way of sort of thinking about the challenge from a social justice perspective of trans equality in this moment. And one of the most righteous, one of the most righteous warriors, I want to say, for trans rights, both sort of in the way he talks about it and in the courtroom, is today's guest, Chase Strangio. Chase is an incredible person. He's a trans man who has a very rare ability to sort of speak both at 30,000 feet and in granular detail about what's going on. Like, he's pursuing cases that he will be arguing. He's part of a case that's going to be argued before the Supreme Court, but he also has just an incredible sense of history and context and is constantly sort of troubling some of the most profound concepts, even in his own work, of what you can do in the law and how you can achieve rights through the law and all the compromises you have to make. And this conversation is one of those great conversations, to my mind, where I come in with like a 3 or 4 or 5 act arc that I'm going to sort of walk through in my head, and then it just goes off in different directions. And as you'll see, this conversation is as much about the law and its limitations as it is about trans rights specifically. It's as much about the way that categories work. It's as much about the way identity works as it is specifically about trans rights. But it moves through all of these themes and unites them in this really interesting way that I think is part of a longer term project that we've been talking about here. We talk on this program a lot about identity, what it means, how it's constructed, what its political potency is, what its limitations are. And so this is a conversation that's in line with that. We've had conversations about that with Brittany Cooper and with Alex Wagner and with Kwame Anthony Appiah and others. But right now, that's all the context to say right now, like, trans bodies and trans people are on the front lines of an extremely high stakes and in many cases life or death battle about them achieving recognition and full equality that will allow them to live and thrive in this America. And Chase Strangio is one of the people on the front lines of that high stakes battle. Where did you grow up, Chase?
I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, outside of Boston.
So that's an interesting place because I think of it as a very like liberal, professional suburb.
It is a wealthy, white, liberal, professional suburb. That's it. That's exactly what it is. And my family is a little different in that we were like that family that sort of fit in that we were also sort of white, upper middle class in many ways. But then I was this sort of radical, queer, trans activist, and my brother was in the military, which is not the typical Newton, Massachusetts experience.
Yeah, you're sort of outside of the lane on both sides, essentially, of like comfortable liberal normalcy when you have those two things.
And then my father is like a raging Trump supporter, Fox News watching. He was actually in a commercial against Elizabeth Warren when she was running.
Are you serious?
When for Senate, a Scott Brown commercial.
Did you grow up in a conservative household? Would you describe it that way?
So not at all. My mom is a incredibly progressive Jew from Scarsdale, New York. And my dad was something different, I guess, at one time. It wasn't an incredibly conservative household growing up. My parents are divorced. My dad has sort of taken a trajectory towards a more sort of conservative path and is an incredibly voracious consumer of Fox News. And so you can see the progression in sort of his mind. And I think he's one of those sort of white men in his late 60s who's like, the world didn't give me what I thought it would, and wow. I'm disappointed.
What has that done to your relationship with him?
It's interesting. We do not have the closest relationship, but we talk about the weather and we talk about football. This is what unites us.
Let me just say, don't sleep on the topics that are non-political that we can talk to people about. Like,
totally.
I actually like having things to talk to people about that are not politics that can bridge divides.
Yes. I mean, football is veering in. And so it does for a lot of reasons, because we are Patriots fans and that there's some political questions that come up. There's
a whole doctoral dissertation written about
we could go down a whole direction there. But we I have this memory of writing my father an email in 2000 around the election. I had just come out as queer at the time and sort of was begging him not to vote for George Bush.
Huh.
And he never wrote back. And this is sort of like a formative sort of crossroads in our relationship where it was like, I was like, listen, I get that your politics are different from mine, but this is my identity. And, this was both in 2000 and 2004, and especially in 2004. And sort of by this point, our relationship was more fractured, but sort of LGBT issues were sort of a huge part of the national conversation. And so that I think he was able to divorce politics from his love for me in his mind, but I was not able to do the same.
It's funny you say that because even as I'm saying, well, it's nice to have things you can talk about that are non-political, right? There's some level at which that itself is a little privileged, or right? That's the whole question. The whole question is what is the sphere of the political and what's the sphere of the personal, and the degree to which we can detach them. And in some ways, there's a meta disagreement about those boundaries.
Completely.
Right?
Yep.
With people in our lives, loved ones. I mean, the people that,
that created us.
Yes, created us. Yeah.
And I think so we have that. And then my mom on the flip side is incredibly progressive. Newton, by and large, is, a liberal place to grow up. I think for me, I was such a repressed young person and was just sort of so unable to come to terms with who I was that it's hard for me to see growing up through the lens of anything else other than this period of time where I just didn't know that I had access to these identity categories that turned out to be so formative for who I am.
So talk about those identity categories. I mean, when you talk about coming out as queer, what was your trajectory of your understanding of your own identity?
So I graduated high school in 2000. I sort of think the day after I graduated was like, oh my God, I'm queer. And so for me, that meant, okay, I have attraction to people of multiple genders. And I think I wasn't really able to sort of come to terms with that at a younger age. I was an athlete growing up. I played girls' sports. And, it's sort of odd as it is to think about, there was this real stigma on queerness in girls' athletics, this idea that oh my God, you're going to be checking us out in the locker room or whatever. And so things that we think about now in the trans context, we don't want trans girls in the locker room. Well, when I was growing up, it was we don't want lesbians, queer kids, in the locker room. And so
even though I feel like my experience in that women's athletic cultures are often some of the most intensely supportive queer spaces that exist.
I think we think of that in sort of because of the stereotypes around masculinity and femininity, but actually in participation, that isn't true. I think there were times when the WNBA, for example, was estimated to be 50% queer, but there was such a small number of people who were actually out.
Right.
So I think because we think of sort of transgressions out of femininity in women's sports, we associate it with queerness and sort of lesbian and bi women, but that's not actually true, I think, in terms of what people feel safe and comfortable with. And so I really struggled sort of just coming out as queer. And I think part of that was both because I was trans and didn't know it and didn't have the language for it. So I was like, I have these attractions, but something else is going on. And even through college, even sort of studying queer and gender theory in the early 2000s, there wasn't a narrative of transness in the public discourse. And I couldn't name myself.
That's really interesting. Where'd you go to college?
I went to Grinnell College in Iowa.
Yeah. So that's really interesting because that is something I think about a lot. We had Kwame Anthony Appiah on the podcast. He wrote a book about identity, and one of the things he talks about is identity it's a social construct. All identities are social constructs, and they ebb and flow in terms of their salience, right? There's a time in European history when being Lutheran matters a lot. You might be chased out of your house and in prison for being Lutheran. Now it's I don't know. Do I know some Lutherans? Maybe. No, it's the least salient identity in the world. So I guess my question to you is, when you say queer, what did that category mean? And when you say there was something else other than being gay, as best as you can describe the subjective experience of that, what was it?
Yeah, I mean, and I say queer and not gay because I think too, for me, it was so much of a political identity as much as it was an identity about sexual attraction.
That's
and I sort of came to terms with my sort of non-heterosexual sexuality in the context of a political left cultural moment and movement. And so to me...
So it was bound up inextricably from the beginning.
Yes, it was as much a political sort of understanding of myself as being sort of outside the norm of gender and sexuality, and also sort of aligned with a desire to destabilize the constructs themselves. I mean, this is going to college in the 2000s, reading Foucault and sort of what is an identity category and sort of what is our subjectivity. And so sort of really challenging sort of the construction of ourself as these sort of assumed, presumed cisgender heterosexual subjects in the world. And so I sort of was both, it was about having sex with people, and that was part of it, but it was a lot more about, I never imagined myself to grow up and get married and live in a sort of middle-class heterosexual context that I grew up in. It was just so outside of the paradigm. And so I was struggling with that. And then also there was this thing that was happening too around, well, what are the available gender options within queerness? And so I was clearly not femme, but I was also clearly not butch. And so this was like a struggle for me because I was like, people were like, you're not butch. And I was like, well, yeah, obviously, like not trying to be. But I didn't know that there was like a sort of more femme masculinity that I could like reside in. And it wasn't until like later in the 2000s that I started to realize that, you know, we don't have to rely on binaries so much. Like, I don't need to be like, I am a lesbian that is butch. Those are fine sets of categories. They just did not describe me.
Right.
And so it took me longer.
Well, so you're zeroing in on something that I wrestle with a lot, which is basically the following. So I went to college in a similar period, and a lot of exposure to postmodernism and Foucault and Judith Butler, whose work at the time seemed like impenetrable and recondite, and now is like one of the most influential paradigms for in our world. It's sort of amazing, right? One of the things that I think gay rights specifically gay rights, right? So not queer, including trans folks, but gay rights depended on, was a kind of almost sort of reactionary essentializing of gayness as a kind of platonic thing that exists in the world. And you heard story after story of people being like, I just knew. And I don't want to, obviously, it's not my place to question anyone's subjective experience of that, but it always had embedded in it that like, this is a thing outside our control. Ergo, any prejudice against it is unreasonable and unfair. And I always sort of felt like, I understand as a political argument, but even if you chose to be gay, like, still shouldn't be, that should make no difference. Like, that was a whole thing, that the argument about gay rights was so tied from, I didn't choose this, ergo you can't discriminate against us. But like, say you did choose it.
Yeah.
So what? Still shouldn't discriminate. And so how do you think about that concept, the way the sort of uncomfortableness of like the essential nature of this experience from exactly the kind of socio-political context that you're putting your own understanding of this in?
Yeah, so two things. One, I think really comes from the reality of the history of the gay rights movement in particular. And I say rights because it was the turn towards the legal system itself that sort of required that for a number of reasons. And sort of Wendy Brown writes a lot about, you know, states of injury and sort of the idea of once you mobilize around rights, which are a sort of state-created idea, you're cohering around this notion that the legal system sets forth for you. You have to become a coherent legal subject. And one of the ways you can get constitutional protections, for example, is to talk about your identity in terms of immutability. And so that is very much part of the constitutional paradigm. And you can really see that becoming more and more reinforced the more that the mainstream lesbian and gay rights movement in particular, exclusive of bisexual and transgender people, was turning towards legal recognition and really assimilationist construct.
Fascinating.
So that's one thing that's happening.
So if you want to make these kinds of arguments to this body under this conceptual and rhetorical architecture, you need to make arguments that are about the identity you have being immutable, because that's how they will listen to you.
Yes, exactly. So you cohere around that. So I think that's one thing that happens. And I think that's one of the reasons that you see bisexual people and transgender people being shoved aside in the beginning, because it's like, oh, you're confusing for this immutable thing. You know, you could make the same argument as to both. There was a very binary sort of, I couldn't possibly be anything but this. I am a woman attracted to a woman and only to women, and I'm a man attracted to men and only men, and sort
Which again was people's subjective experience.
Yes,
I don't want to like
right. It totally yes. Although again, our subjective experience is constrained by the possibilities that are imposed upon us,
also
and so
true, yes.
so it's like it's all of that,
yes.
and so that I think was definitely a part of it. And then I think the other thing is that the trajectory of the movement obviously was within the political context of, this is the United States movement, in the political context of the United States, where whiteness and maleness are salient and supreme and sort of consolidate with power. And so you also have the history of the AIDS crisis in the 80s and the fact that rich white gay men are impacted. And so you have this experience of crisis among a group of people that, you know, were repressed and in crisis in other ways because of their sexuality, but otherwise held a lot of social power and capital and political power. And the movement then grows out of a lot of the leadership that is led by white men. And so that allows an alignment with power that is very specific to the gayness, to whiteness and maleness. And so that, again, is a sort of logical turn to the legal system where you can say, I am just like you. And in fact, you look a lot like them being those in power. And so the sort of narrative of the sort of mainstream LGBT rights movement looks a lot like an alignment with political power.
I mean, far be it from me to raise the banner for, Larry Kramer and, Harvey Milk but it was a very successful movement. And extremely radical in many ways.
No, it was.
Very radical formations.
No. Okay, so because of how it then progressed, it's easy to look back and say, these are a bunch of white men and they had a lot of power. And of course, in the moment, they were completely focused on disruption and political organizing.
And not dying.
And Peter Staley continues to be an incredibly important voice. So I don't mean to say ACT UP was not the sort of radical, political resistance movement that it was. And I think we have to acknowledge that their ability to access the government in the end was inextricable from the fact that there was white male leadership.
And social capital embedded in that.
Yes.
And then also as it moved towards the courts, and in terms of what you're saying is a kind of way of adapting the sort of language, the rhetoric, the sort of conceptual architecture that the courts would understand into what, in a sort of definitional identity sense, what gayness is as a kind of immutable characteristic to get those claims recognized by a state that was, in the beginning, completely antagonistic and sometimes befuddled by the claims.
Yes, absolutely. And you can see, of course, the evolution was from sort of the demands of the LGBT movement, which were really about sort of radical kinship and caretaking to marriage.
Yeah.
And
domesticity.
It sort of kills me to read Justice Kennedy's opinion in Obergefell, which is the case that ultimately brings marriage equality to the United States, because in it is this idea that there is no more foundational structure than marriage. It's the most conservative thing you've ever read. It's like, how tragic would it be to wander the earth alone without a spouse? And you're like, oh my God, our movement created this. We have sort of reinforced civil marriage beyond recognition. And that, was sort of inevitable, but I think tracing the progression is sad.
Right. Although, again, I find myself as I'm the straight white cis male here who's gonna stand up for the...
Yeah. Well, I have to be extra critical of my...
No, I mean, I guess I just sort of think there's isn't it the case that in some ways, every successful movement of social liberation, radical equality, ends up in a position where it's seen as conservative?
If you turn to the legal system. So this is
you think the legalism is part of what has produced this?
I think there's a fundamental question about sort of whether political organizing and legal reform change are truly compatible. And that if you're going to build power...
Aren't you a lawyer with a case before the Supreme Court in a few weeks?
So this is a really challenging question.
You sound like me talking about cable news.
Yes. Well, right. So,
I don't know if it's redeemable, really, frankly.
And here I am doing it and being completely complicit in the whole thing. I often will start out a talk being I am a civil rights and constitutional lawyer who fundamentally doesn't believe in the Constitution and the legal system. And yet I think,
definitely open your Supreme Court arguments with that.
But it's here we are where I think it is incumbent upon us as lawyers, complicit as we are in a system that is foundationally sort of about preserving chattel slavery and a whole bunch of other things that I think we should just recognize to be the foundations, to sort of say, we are building this system. It distributes harms. And that doesn't mean we can't use it to reduce harms, but we are always going to be distributing them. And so it's not so much a question of, do we throw up our hands and sort of do nothing with it, which, I think is one political choice to make. I think the choice that I have personally made is to say, I recognize that every intervention within this system is always going to be harmful in some way. And so what I believe in is accounting for those harms and naming them. Because by making them invisible, we're suggesting that there could be an intervention that is somehow harmless.
But isn't that just life, or isn't that just politics? Isn't it the case that life involves trade-offs and politics involves trade-offs just inescapably? Every action you take is gonna have some consequences, often unforeseen. I'm trying to make you less tortured about your work.
Oh yeah. Well, so okay, good luck. But
I just don't know how much that's you seem to be pegging that on the legal system, which is basically, if I hear you correctly, you're saying operating within the legal system is operating within the sphere of power, and you advocate as much as possible to reduce harms on those without power within the sphere of power, while understanding that in the interaction with the sphere of power, you are essentially reifying power's hold.
Yeah, I mean, that sums it up quite well.
So I guess my point is that, like, let's say you were an organizer, like, and you had nothing to do with that. Like, you would still be totally tortured over a million trade-offs you were making.
I mean, I don't know that I'm actually tortured over them, right? So I think this is really the point, is that the legal system is a particular set of trade-offs that I am the most familiar with.
Right.
And I see how these particular trade-offs end up hindering other things, like organizing, for example, or base building and power building, because of the nature of creating a coherent legal narrative.
Right.
And so then, given that this is the choice that I've made, this is the intervention that I am pursuing, I believe in making visible those trade-offs. Because to
That's
suggest
really well said.
that my concern is always that, that there's this search for the perfect intervention in the system. And that quest is a troubling one. And so I'm more about, these are our choices. Let's see the consequences and lay them out so we can understand.
My favorite metaphor on this, which I'm going to unspool here because you're a football fan, is kickoff return coverage. Basically, I always think of it this way when you think about organizing, political work, legal work, intellectual work, right? On kickoff return coverage, everyone needs to run in their lane and not chase the ball. Because if everyone runs after the ball, then, like, you open yourself up to a huge return. But, like, everyone's got to, like, different people do different things. Yeah. And, like, not everyone has to run after the ball. And, like, one of those people is going to get the tackle because maybe he cuts back across the field. And, like, if everybody goes and does the same thing, like, it doesn't work that way. Like, people need to do different things.
Yes, and I believe that. And I think that different people in different lanes think that they can take over other lanes with a lot, and then
or like to offer advice, like the way that you should be organizing is right.
Or I'm going to define organizing as, and you're like, that isn't organizing, that is legal work in some sort of convoluted turn of events.
All right, I want to get back to this question of what this conceptual entity of this identity that you didn't have the vocabulary for, and I want to hear about that right after we take this short break.
So you want to be president? I've watched many candidates run for their party's nomination, but only a few knew how to get it.
I am paying for this microphone.
My podcast is about what it takes to get the nomination. 6 episodes, 6 timeless themes that separate the few winners from the many losers.
The hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
So You Want to Be President with Chris Matthews, an MSNBC podcast. Search now wherever you're listening and subscribe. Episode 4 available now.
So you want to be president? I've watched many candidates run for their party's nomination, but only a few knew how to get it.
I feel your pain.
My podcast is about what it takes to get the nomination. 6 episodes, 6 timeless themes that separate the few winners from the many losers.
This campaign was and will remain the great honor of my life.
So You Want to Be President with Chris Matthews, an MSNBC podcast. Search now wherever you're listening and subscribe. Episode 4 available now.
You didn't have as an available identity in a sort of coherent sense the notion of being trans when you were in college and you were sort of embedded in queer theory and thinking about all these things. How did that identity present itself to you in a sort of conceptual way or as in a more personal way?
I think about this a lot because one of the things that's challenging about identity formation is that we're so influenced by sort of the narrative we think we're supposed to tell. And this is especially true with trans identity because there's this sense of, oh, you're supposed to tell this narrative to get medical care. And so for a long time, I don't know if I reverse engineered the truth of my experience to be validated or whether it was my experience, because it's like the doctor wants to hear I always felt like a boy and that's why I need this. And so you start to reify that and you're like, was that my experience or am I just so used to telling it because I need the gatekeepers to believe me to be valid?
That's fascinating because that's a direct analog to what we were just talking about gay and lesbian identity with the legal system, right? Like the immutability is like a core thing. So if you want to get heard by the lawyers, you got to say, and what you're saying is if you want to get heard by the doctors in this case, then you have to tell a story that fits
their narrative. They become the gatekeepers and then the legal system becomes the next one. And so it was not my experience that I have some like sort of memory of a tortured childhood where I was like, I am a boy and I know I'm a boy and nobody's listening to me. That is some people's experience. It was not mine. I definitely had something going on that I couldn't name. And maybe it was because I came of age at a time when there was no trans narrative to look to understand myself. But I think for me, it was like the beginning of like the emergence of some popular culture discourse. Like Boys Don't Cry was my real first like, okay, there's this story, there's Brandon Tina's story, and I'm watching Hilary Swank play this, and there's something resonant, but not exactly, and I don't really know, and I sort of was grasping for some sense that I existed in the world, but I could never see it reflected back to me. And then I think it was really in sort of my political organizing after college, as I sort of became involved in sort of prison abolition work, which, there's so many queer and trans people in that work, that I started to meet actual trans people. And this was in Boston, between 2005 and 2007 is when I really started to sort of come out as trans. But I wasn't a super binary person. I wasn't like, I am a man, and I am finally realizing that. It was sort of a slow progression of, I realized that I can have sort of bodily formations that exist sort of in the liminal space between male and female. And that sort of, the more I became comfortable with that, the more I felt at home in my body, which helps us feel at home in the world. And that was so formative for me to just be able to say, so I can change my name and I can do some things, but I'm just sort of going to own that there is no coherent maleness or femaleness that is going to feel completely at home for me, and that is okay. And that'll happen for me in law school, pretty much.
Wow.
It was a combination of political organizing, meeting trans people, the popular culture changing, and then just becoming a more confident person and sort of being able to name that for myself.
How do you, let's take a 65-year-old, like generally open-minded liberal who is just sort of like not particularly bigoted about trans folks, but also just a little like unclear, sometimes in ways that are not awesome, but not animated by animus. How do you sort of like describe that conceptual category when the category itself rests, I think, in this like really profound and liberatory way on the troubling of these categories that said 65-year-old might have as the pillars they've set up?
Yeah, so I think that like I myself am not like the best teacher of like the trans experience. In terms, or like my experience is not always the best because it is so much in the middle, and I think that is a lot of times people really do grasp for binaries. I mean, we can see that as parents with our children. It's like everyone's like can't even conceptualize a human without a gender.
It's literally the first question. It's the first thing. It's everything.
It's everything. So, but I think what does help is if you start to just really ask people sort of, how do you know what your gender is? If you ask anyone that, they'll say, well, I just know. And they're like, well, how do you know? And some people will say, my parents told me. Some people say, I had a brother, I had a sister. And it's like, well, are you satisfied with that? Are you satisfied with that knowledge? And then, sometimes people say, oh, I have a penis. And it's like, is that what you want to define who you are in this sort of category that is so salient? If you really do take the time to sit with someone and say, for me, I just know as much as you know that your body is what it's supposed to be, that you are who you are, that I know that about myself too. Yeah. It's just that no one believes me when I say it. Right. And so then when you aren't believed, then the more you're challenged, the harder it is to explain. And I think this is how we end up reifying these categories as well, through the doubt of the listener. And so one of the things that, just drives me like bananas are these New York Times op-eds by cis women about like what makes a woman. And there's this one from 2015 that I will never get out of my head about Caitlyn Jenner. And it's criticizing her for being sort of reifying these norms of femininity that cis women spent decades trying to shed. And what troubles me about it is that two things. One, it's as if somehow it's trans people's fault that gender exists. Right. When it's like, we are
That's the opposite.
It's the opposite. Like, we didn't do this to you.
Right.
And then the other thing.
Trans people are the ones that created gender.
Yes, we're the ones. Like, it's like, no, that's wrong. And then the second thing is this idea that a lot of trans people will say things like, I know I'm a man because I like masculine things. The only reason we say that is because no one believes us when we say, I just know who I am. Right. And so we have to repeat a norm that is familiar to be believed.
Right, because to go back to the Appia point, like, we're all swimming in the same water, which is society. Like, we can't open up our brains to show you our private life. Like, we have concepts and words and categories that we all share as a matter of, like, linguistics. Like, the meaning of things are their public meaning that we all agree to through conversation. Like, there's no way out of that, right? And in fact, the word trans, like, what happens through the process of identity formation as a sort of public activity is that we actually create new words and new categories. Like, that's what we're doing collectively.
That are contingent on the ones that were there before. And
yes, they have to be, you can't build them from nothing.
Yes, right. Which is one of the reasons why these cases at the Supreme Court are so baffling. The sort of nature of the legal rights, but also material access to survival that trans people have had has been predicated on utilizing federal prohibitions on sex discrimination. Right. And it's so intuitive because you can't actually describe transness without thinking about sex as a category. It is like that which transgresses from one side to the other. And so, of course, it is inherently a part of the thing. And that's sort of the language that produces our ability to understand ourselves is the same things that we then use to leverage the systems that are in place to then ensure our survival.
So let's talk about sort of the legal world we're in right now with trans rights. And we'll talk first about the case that I think is set to be argued in October that you're working on. What is the question before the court in that case?
So there are 3 cases before the court that are set to be argued on October 8th, and they deal all with employment. And the central question is whether Title VII, which is the federal law that prohibits discrimination because of sex, encompasses discrimination against someone because that person is lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. It's really a question of, does the state of federal law currently protect LGBTQ workers?
It's currently, as a matter of both sort of the interpretation of statutory law and Supreme Court law, that if someone walks in and for a job and you say, no, we don't hire women accountants, like that, you can't do that. Or you say you're fired because you're a woman and we don't like women accountants. Like that's clearly and flatly against the law as understood now, correct?
Correct.
Right. So the question is essentially the part of the law, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, that makes that the case, does that apply to LGBT folks?
Yeah, to an employer who says, no, I'm going to fire you because you're a lesbian, or I'm going to fire you because you're transgender. These aren't cases where there's a dispute. They're not saying...
No, they're saying that's
why we fired you.
Yeah.
So the state of the law currently is not just you can't say, I'm going to fire you because you're a woman. You also can't say, I'm going to fire you because you're a masculine woman. And so under our Supreme Court precedent,
that is currently the law?
that is currently the law.
Huh.
So
that's interesting.
Yeah,
so we've already gotten to that point where you can't say like, you should be wearing skirts and not pants and like tank tops and not sweaters and I'm firing you. Like that's not cool.
That's not cool with some caveats. So the Supreme Court, in a decision called Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins, ruled that the prohibition on discrimination because of sex includes sex stereotypes. And in that case, It was at Price Waterhouse an accountant who was...
I just pulled accountant out of my head.
Yeah, no, I mean, she was seen as too masculine and she didn't get promoted. And the record was, there was things like, you should go to charm school and you should wear lipstick. And the Supreme Court held in a plurality. So it's not a straight 5-4 sort of majority decision as to the reasoning, but held that was impermissible sex discrimination under Title VII. So actually, that case has been sort of the foundation of the majority of lower court rulings under a host of federal laws that have been used to protect trans people from discrimination for decades. So this is not a new thing. And in fact, trans people and LGBT people more recently have been experiencing quite a bit of favorable rulings in the lower courts. For a long time, under the Price Waterhouse, sex stereotyping is prohibited. So what is alarming about this current moment is, so we have 3 cases at the court. The court is going to decide this question. And we have the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, under Obama had taken the explicit position as well that Title VII prohibits per se discrimination based on sexual orientation and transgender status. That is still the position of the EEOC. Before the Supreme Court, the United States is represented by the Solicitor General from the Justice Department. The Justice Department is not taking that position. The Trump administration fully supports firing workers because they are LGBT. And so they have filed a brief in both the sexual orientation context and the trans status context saying Title VII does not and should not be interpreted to cover LGBT workers. Now, here's what's more astonishing and frankly should terrify people even more. I mean, I think people should care about LGBT workers, but they are proposing that Title VII itself should not be understood to include the expansive sex stereotyping protections that it has included for the last 2 decades.
They want to roll back the Price Waterhouse.
They want to roll back Price Waterhouse significantly because and they have somewhat contradictory language in their briefing. But what their argument in the lower court and what their brief suggests to me is that they're advocating for a world in which employers can fire a woman for being gender nonconforming as long as they fire a man for being gender nonconforming as well, under sort of like a 2 wrongs do make a right. Because what they want and what they believe in is like a gender complementary world.
I mean, I don't know it's the case, but like in Donald Trump's 50 years as a boss, has he ever fired a woman because she didn't dress feminine enough? Like, that seems a distinct possibility.
Yeah, it seems like really probable. And of course, that happens all the time, and the law only like reaches so much. But to have a sort of normative legal statement
endorsed by the Department of Justice,
potentially being codified by the Supreme Court, rolling back how we understand sex discrimination law that has been sort of the very linchpin of inclusion of cisgender women in the workplace and society at large. That is what is at stake in these cases. So this is an opportunity for the Justice Department to not just make a big anti-LGBTQ announcement, which, they're perfectly comfortable doing and have done in a host of contexts, but to really ask the Supreme Court to fundamentally alter the state of sex discrimination law in ways that are going to transform not just employment, but education protections, housing protections, credit protections.
Wow.
And so I think what has been lost on people, because it's this wonky statutory interpretation argument, is that this could be a wholesale redefinition of federal civil rights law, and that's just the beginning.
And you're working on one of those cases.
Yes, correct.
Can you tell me about your client in that case?
Yeah, so the ACLU is representing Amy Stevens, and she was a funeral director at a funeral home in Michigan, and she, sort of worked, presenting outwardly as a man. She was struggling with her gender, sort of going to counseling, finally reached a point, as many transgender people do, that it was like, this is life or death. I only have one life. I have to be who I am. Sort of came out to her wife. Her wife stuck by her, and she then decides, I've been working for this company for 6 years. I'm going to tell my boss. She writes this beautiful letter explaining her struggle, coming out to her boss, and he fires her. She loses her job. She loses her health insurance. Her entire life becomes precarious. This is in 2014. Obama is president. The EEOC brings the lawsuit on her behalf. So the lawsuit is actually the EEOC versus the funeral home. So they are the parties in the case. We intervened on her behalf after the election out of concern that the EEOC would no longer defend the interests of Amy.
That'll be one of the 3 cases that are consolidated and argued October 8th.
Yes.
You're also working on the lawsuit to attempt to block the proposed ban on trans soldiers in the U.S. military. What is the status of that case?
So trans people obviously, have been around forever. But I think, we started to become more visible in public discourse and popular culture in sort of the 2010s. And one of the things that happened was that at the end of Obama's second term, you started to see a lot of regulatory changes that allowed for inclusion of trans people quite explicitly in a host of contexts, including in schools, in the military, in the context of the Affordable Care Act and accessing health care. And the second the Trump administration came into power, they were systematically taking these things away. So rescinding the education guidance for trans students was one of the first things that Sessions and DeVos did in February of 2017. Shortly thereafter, there had been an attempt in Congress to restrict access to health care for trans service members. That failed at the time in the Republican-controlled House. And that was really shocking to the right. And
I remember being sort of amazed.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was Vicky Hartzler's amendment, and it was a big win. And apparently, the sort of stories are that Donald Trump was frustrated. And so in July of 2017, sort of out of nowhere, to the surprise of everyone, including his defense secretary, he tweets the trans military ban in a series of 3 tweets. And we sue, along with a number of other people, to try to stop the ban from going into effect in the summer of 2017. Those lawsuits are initially successful, and then they sort of, as they did in multiple sort of executive action contexts, issued a sort of modified version of the ban that was pretty much the same thing, but sort of more palatable to the courts.
Yeah.
And that was, proved harder to stop. And ultimately, the Supreme Court lifted the injunctions. So the ban is currently in effect while the cases are being litigated in the lower courts. So it's, unlikely to be resolved through litigation before the 2020 election.
How do you understand the Trump administration, the Republican Party, the political rights targeting of trans folks as a priority for their agenda?
I mean, I think one of the things that I have always sort of seen about looking at trans people is that we are a very easy target because it's easy to peel our allies away from us. So you can sort of align yourself quickly with even sort of liberals who are uncomfortable with trans existence. You can even, there are LGB folks who are just leave them behind. And so we can really be a sort of canary in the coal mine of what's coming. And I think of sort of North Carolina as a perfect example of this, because in North Carolina, the state of North Carolina, you have a place that had a very strategic GOP takeover of their state legislature. And you could see sort of the testing ground of a lot of different things: voter suppression laws, anti-immigrant laws, and anti-trans laws. And so there was something about the fact that transness, again, I think because we exist in this sort of, at times, liminal space as sort of a threat to the coherence of gender norms, which is what the right relies on so heavily to control and surveil people's bodies, that we're an easy and first order target.
I mean, to me, the other side of that coin, to get to your point about the ways in which the LGB movement particularly worked in this kind of conservative domestic register on marriage equality, the flip side of that is that there is something unavoidably radical, a radical challenge to gender norms posed by transness that gayness and lesbianness doesn't, right? Like, to me, it speaks to the fact that there is something fundamentally, and I'm saying this in a good way, like, I think these are frameworks that deserve to be disrupted, but like, it is inescapably disruption, right?
I want it to be, but even here you can see, look, right? Like the first, like turns towards the military as first order reform,
right.
Like
But that's also the history of every civil right. I mean,
it is.
Truman integrating the army is like one of the first big 20th century civil rights moments.
But when you're like at the stage where your movement doesn't have formal equality, I think you're eager to say, let's not do the same thing. So we could have, in the LGBT movement, we could have said, instead of the turn to the state for marriage as the organizing principle of the family, why not demand universal health care? If one of the big things was, and I realize it's not incumbent upon the group that is excluded to transform the system, for everyone. But if you're sort of a left-leaning person within that category, you're like, well, formal equality doesn't achieve what it sets out to achieve. Now, it does achieve something. I get that. Like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is an incredible achievement. Brown versus Board of Education is an incredible achievement. We have a long way to go in sort of realizing anything close to the eradication of white supremacy and sort of, actually disrupting.
Even school desegregation
is complete another, we're not there. I mean, look at your, so I guess the question is, yes, you can say every civil rights movement follows this trajectory, and now we're at the trans movement going to, consolidation of identity, military, formal equality, and of course that is the blueprint, so we follow it. But I think there's a real question about how is it done and what is lost. And so I think there is a way where transness could be seen as an inherently sort of liminal and disruptive, but then at the same time you have these super binary trans people who are like out there in the world and they exist and their identities are real, and that is part of the we look just like you. That it's just as easy to follow that model. So I think where we are is we're in crisis, and the Supreme Court, we have to hold the line. So from my perspective, that there are material goods on the line. This isn't an abstract question of formal equality anymore, because the threat is taking something incredibly significant away. And while we hold that line, however, what are the norms that we're willing to entrench? And I think those are hard questions when you're a movement lawyer, because the legal system demands of you quite a lot of compromise. And in doing that level of compromise, you are leaving behind a lot of people. And so as you're holding the line, as you're engaging in harm reduction, I think there's a lot to really reflect on and say, I have a lot of power in this moment. I am making these arguments to the Supreme Court. There are some I am not going to make. And I think we've really learned that over time more and more. And I hope that sort of the more we learn from each other, the more we're able to sort of not rely on arguments that are actually affirmatively damaging to others.
You talked about Boys Don't Cry, and two things are striking me. One is the kind of rapidity of cultural change in terms of representation in the last 2 or 3 years, 4 years maybe, which isn't to say like it's adequate, but just like if you graphed it, like there's a real uptick in the last 3 or 4 years in terms of just mainstream representation of trans folks. And then also like I'm sort of fascinated by the ways in which understanding of gender and gender identity, and particularly gender fluidity, are increasingly like common embedded in younger people. I don't have a ton of like interactions with 14-year-olds or 17-year-olds right now, but my sense, and particularly even just looking at my young kids, is their set of normal is really different than what like our set of normal was 20 years ago and 20 years before that. And I wonder like how you think about how that cultural change works.
I mean, I am someone who's like, I love consuming popular culture. So like I said, I was like looking for it. So I like it. I think representation is incredibly powerful. I joke that, 10 years of litigation on trans rights was like not as effective as Laverne Cox saying Google Gavin Grimm at the Grammys. It's like that moment was as transformative as our years of litigation, and they were related.
Yeah, of course, yes.
And there's
Gavin Grimm had a lawsuit.
Yes,
I mean,
and Gavin Grimm had a lawsuit, and litigation is storytelling, and I believe in the law as storytelling, and so I think it's all related. I think that sort of we reflect back to each other.
Let me just say that Gavin Grimm is a trans student in Virginia who sued his school board for them denying him access to the bathroom that he wanted to use. Right?
Yes, and then Kate went up to the Supreme Court. It got sent back down after the election, and it's actually still being litigated, even though he's graduated high school years ago. So I think about this a lot. I think representation is critically important. It changes the ability of young people to see themselves in the world and therefore name themselves, which is in and of itself survival. It would have been for me. I remember like sort of desperately sort of on dial-up internet in my mom's house when I was 16 years old, trying to find like clips of things like in my like repressed queerness, and there was nothing that sort of resonated back to me myself. And so this is a huge moment. One thing I will say as a caution is that trans people have often been consumed as sort of like interesting, exotic, fetishistic things. And so there's a way where we fit nicely into sort of the consumptive culture of sort of, sort of fashion movies. It's sort of, it's
like a thrillingly transgressive.
And like, ooh, like I'm going to, people, like tons of people watch trans porn. Like they're hating on us, but they're like consuming our bodies in this like way because it's sort of like, when people are sort of gender transgressive, that something like signals something sexual and deviant, and that then makes people think about sex. And so there's this very like way in which particularly trans women of color are sexualized or criminalized as sex workers. And so it's not unrelated into sort of how representation has taken off. And so we have to really think about that, because then in turn, the people who aren't on the big screens are still on the street being attacked and criminalized, because there's a backlash to the very notion of seeing that which was formerly sort of unseen. And something that's really interesting is that two trans actors who are sort of in popular culture in a big way right now were formerly plaintiffs in these big lawsuits. So Hunter Schafer, who's on Euphoria, was one of our lead plaintiffs in the challenge to HB2 in North Carolina, and Nicole Mange, who's on the CW, was also challenged her school district's exclusion of her from the restroom when she was a young girl. And what's interesting about that is they are both incredibly sort of gender-conforming, attractive white girls who served both the vehicle of telling a story in the courtroom and telling a story to broader popular culture. And so these are the sort of overlapping sites of power. And so the same trans bodies are, they are agents in their own right. I don't mean to say that, and I think if you talk to either of them, they would acknowledge this, that there is something about their privilege in sort of how their gender and their bodies are seen and understood that is a vehicle in the courtroom and a vehicle on the television.
How do you talk about gender with your child?
So what's interesting is that one thing that you mentioned is that, our understanding of gender is sort of evolving and young people's understanding is evolving. But yet I see in parenting, it's almost like we're regressing in a lot of ways. It's like stores are more gendered in their toys. Car departments are more gendered. And so I've really seen like a sort of like, even among progressive parents, there is a real sort of reliance on gender as like an organizing reality.
I will say that my experience of I have 3 children. I have a girl, a boy, and a girl, 7, 5, and 20 months, or at least that's how I'm labeling them now. I don't know.
Yeah.
But the force of gender propaganda that you experience as a parent is just, and I think particularly because like my wife and I think about this a lot, and she was a gender studies major, and it's wild how intense it is. And it's so crazy too how everyone's like, oh, the boys just want to play with the toy. Like there's also like this weird story that people feel the need to talk about like this essential biological nature revealing itself. And like I tried to give her the truck and she didn't want the truck. And like that might be true. I mean, like all sorts of kids want all sorts of things, but it's also like it's crazy how intense
it is.
It's
like
it's really intense.
People glue bows on their bald babies to make sure everyone genders them correctly. And so I think for me, one of the things I say a lot is like in my home, it's like we talk about bodies and behaviors as not falling within a binary. And so as much as you would say girls can be anything, I would say any body part can be on a girl and any body part can be on a boy. Because it simply wouldn't work in my house to say something else. Because my body doesn't look like a typical boy's body or a typical girl's body. And so my kid understands me as her father, and I am her father, and I don't look like the boys that she knows to be boys, and sort of those sort of genital characteristics. And so her conception of the world is that there are these categories, they exist, they're absurd in her mind in a lot of ways, and that you just claim that which works for you. And I think you can see a lot if you sort of take away those assumptions, both as assigned to the body and as assigned to behaviors, how much really isn't preordained in the ways that we see, and sort of how the self-segregation of kids by, sort of by genders that happens at an incredibly young age. If we didn't impose so much on them, it would happen so much less. And it's a shame because we sort of tolerate segregation of gender in society in ways that we presume to be neutral when it is not.
What do you mean by that?
So, gender-specific restrooms,
Right.
gender-specific dress codes. We sort of tolerate them. We're like, girls wear these kind of bathing suits.
It's
boys-
not tolerate.
but We rely on them. We
it's not-
organize
we don't,
society.
like, barely tolerate
Right, okay,
gender
it's
segregated
different. So
bathrooms.
right. That is a really well taken point. It is in fact like we rely on them as
Heavily.
so it's like there is no other category that is protected in the law, for just to take one example, that we would tolerate segregation
Right.
in. We couldn't say this religion goes in this bathroom, this religion.
Right, of course.
And of course, the legacy of white supremacy is unique, and that there's nothing like anti-Black racism in the United States. So it's not that all forms of segregation are the same.
Right.
But the reliance on segregation of gender as an organizing principle of society has very serious costs in terms of caretaking labor, in terms of access to the workplace. In
Well,
terms
that's because
of
we think of it as this gets back to what the radical disruption to me of a lot of Judith Butler's work and others is just like we think of it. We are taught to think of it as an essential cleavage in the universe. Like there's a line in I think in philosopher Wittgenstein where he talks about cutting the world at its joints, right? That like categories like make sense in some sort of like deep and satisfying way, and like we think of gender as being that like gender cuts the world at its joints, that like that binary is like it's as old as time, and like languages have two genders in their in the way they have adjectives, and like this is just like a universal truth about the universe.
And I think that of course it's just not true, because
Right.
there are girls that have penises, and there are boys that have vaginas, and there are bodies that vary in every way in between. And I think one of my hopes for the trans discourse in the future, in the law and in society, is that we don't fear the body. We don't fear the truth of our body, because the reality is that if the more that we hide sort of that we have bodies that don't neatly compartmentalize into male and female, the more this continues. But the reality is that, naming the sort of biological realities of male and female is as much a social and political choice
Right.
as the behaviors
Yes.
that we associate
Yeah,
with sex.
there's a book by Professor Brown, Anna Fausta Sterling, called Sexing the Body, which is an amazing book, which actually is just a book that says like, look, okay, fine, you want to talk about the biology. Actually, the biology itself is super complicated. And in fact, the way that the biology is dealt with at birth is completely overdetermined by the cultural category. So like doctors give medical interventions on newborns to make sure that body parts essentially conform to social expectations. Like it's actually the social expectation that's driving the physical intervention with the actual natural body.
Which is an assaultive intervention that actually has real harms and costs. And I think the weaponization of so-called biological sex in the law is a wholly new construction.
Right.
This is a new political construct that's designed to exclude, not to define.
But it is the case. I mean, I'm not trying to argue some reactionary version of this, but what I guess I do want to say is that like the depth to which we all swim in the sense of gender essentialism is intense and hard to overcome.
Agreed.
Like it really
it's
is.
my
Like
life's
even for
work.
myself, I like there's some level at which like I intellectually like think that it's all but like just like the mythos of it is so deep and so like hammered into us that it takes like actual intellectual effort, the undoing.
I think that's right. Although I think that it, when at that base level, but when we think about the distribution of social goods and society being organized, the reality is that we don't organize society on the body in the way that we sort of talk about it when trans people come into the picture. It's not like there's someone standing outside the bathroom checking your genitals.
Right.
We actually
That's
organize
totally
society based on
totally
a self-determination of gender.
That's absolutely right.
And so it's like it's
yes,
only,
we do not show an ID.
We
That's
don't
right.
show an ID. We don't show, and we certainly don't show our genitals when we walk in the bathroom. And,
No.
and so thank God. But
Right.
that, it's sort of like the
That's
world.
a great point.
It's like that.
Like
is
that's
how-
a cultural cultural definition right there.
it's
Like
right.
and
Yeah,
self-definition.
yes,
Like we
completely.
all just take it for granted that you self-define
Yes.
before trans people come in the picture. There is no regime that's created.
completely.
Right.
It's only after the fact to
Right.
exclude, and so that
Right, because the disruption represents such a threat.
it is a huge huge threat, but it is one that is also, and one of the things that we always talked about is like, let's say everyone's like, oh, in 1964, Congress couldn't have meant that, trans people were included because that would mean that trans people could use the bathroom. But if I walked into Congress in 1964 and said, where's the bathroom? They would send me to the men's bathroom, even though that like my genitals don't align.
Right.
So it's actually, we organize things by so many cues that just, it's not as neat. They think their rule is neat and that our rule is messy.
That's right.
But the reality is it's all messy and we make choices. And so I think that over time, we're just going to see that we're making these choices. And the more comfortable we are with the reality that your rule is no neater than ours, that we're just going to have to come to terms with like the fact that you might be peeing next to someone with different genitals than you. And that's just been true forever.
Chase Strangio is a lawyer at the ACLU, a member of the legal team that is representing Amy Stevens before the Supreme Court this October, someone that I read regularly on the twitter.com. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
Once again, my great thanks to Chase Strangio, who is a lawyer for the ACLU. I learned so much. I'm still thinking about the conversation days later. I hope you will too. And I think it's one of those, Chase is such a deep, profound, and kind of like compact thinker that it's one of those conversations that I think I'm probably going to listen to a few times to make sure that everything penetrates. So huge thanks to Chase for that. Like I said up in the intro, there's a ton of conversations we've had about identity, and you can check those out on our website. We will post some links to those. Also, some WithPod news. Exciting. We just announced a live podcast that's going to be taking place at the Texas Tribune Festival in Austin, Texas with Senator Ted Cruz. To find out more about how to see us there, you can go to the website for the festival. It's festival.texastribune.org. It's part of a larger project we're going to be announcing very soon. You can keep an eye out for that. But for now, if you happen to be in Texas, if you would like to see me and Ted Cruz have a conversation, which I think is going to be fascinating for a bunch of reasons, you can go to festival.texastribune.org and keep your eyes peeled for a bigger announcement about more live WithPods coming your way. As always, you can tweet us with the hashtag WithPod, email withpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your feedback. Why Is This Happening is presented by MSNBC and NBC News, produced by the All In team, and features music by Eddie Cooper. You can see more of our work, including links to things we mentioned here, by going to NBCnews.com/whyistishappening.
We eat to live, but food is so much more than that. I'm Andrew Zimmern, chef, world traveler, and host of a new series on MSNBC. Join me as I explore our country, looking at the biggest social and political questions of the day through the lens of food. This week, discover how our melting pot of cultures is reflected by the food on our plates. I've spent years in the restaurant business, and without immigrants and migrant workers, our food system would collapse. I'm tackling the issue of immigration on the premiere episode of What's Eating America, Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern, only on MSNBC.